Bonjour, good morning. The issue I will talk about is inspired by Raison et Culture, which is an audiography where Moscovici stated that social thinking is both organized by culture and by representations. More precisely, my issue concerns the foundation from which we researchers working in a particular cultural context build our scientific objects and interpret results about them. This rationality relativism questions the non-negotiable character of our thinking categories. We can say the same concerning the radical distinction that we often make between modernity and traditionalism. It is also the case concerning the basic taxonomic categories supposed to underlie the modern society's organization as that of the public versus private space, for instance. To comply with Moscovici's wording, those categories operate as irresistible ideas. They seem to us as they seem to us as inviolable because dependent on a seemingly external reality. Wittgenstein said about those thinking postulates that his world vision doesn't arise from his conviction of his straightness, but it is the inherited background in which he distinguishes the true from the false. However, being faced in several respects to a purely culture in the sense of Moscovici produces a certain reflexivity. This leads us as researchers to question the postulates that underlie our own representation of the objects about which we study social representations. That's a mental gymnastic that requires to understand how our own rationality is relative. The names we give to objects and the very fact of constituting them as common sense thinking categories would be determined by the basic postulates on which our particular own specific thinking is founded. A basic postulate that often underlies our research perspective is that individuals living in a modern nation state couldn't conceive the basic notions of the life organization outside a modern thinking framework. It is as if there couldn't exist interferences between modernity and traditional way of thinking. Moscovici challenged the radical distinction between modernity and traditionalism when he stated that there is a continuum between them. According to him, there is a continuum between the most elementary religion and the most advanced science. Otherwise, culture is neither a hermetic nor an homogeneous system. When different groups coexist, it produces mixed cultural contents. However, in some contexts, like in Tunisia, for instance, it seems that it wouldn't be only a mechanical juxtaposition of values, norms, and beliefs. It would be rather a reorganization of meanings. In this concern, we can quote Tunisian research conclusions showing that in their definition of the good spouse, women use the same categories that underlie the gender roles traditional structure, but turning them in their favor. This is as to find a balance between emancipation, will, and a traditional norms perpetuation. Furthermore, we made a thorough exploration in Tunisia by focus groups of concepts supposed to found the modern collective life as the notion of state, law, society, citizenship, private public space, etc. we applied the semantic structure analysis to the collected discourse. Results show that our irresistible concepts could be cantilevered, je ne sais pas si le mot est correct, en porte-à-faux, cantilevered outside Western areas. We identified through the discourse dimensions opposing terms that correspond to an unexpected taxonomic categories system, or in other words, to an unexpected rationality. I have to precise in this concern that according to Lévi-Strauss, both traditional and modern societies are characterized by antinomic thinking structures. It is an invariant within which there is, however, an infinite variety of distinction types. So we search for the antinomies which structure the collected discourse. Results show, for instance, that the private-public space opposition doesn't operate for the Tunisian ordinary citizen. However, this does not prevent the explicit use of the private-public opposition terms in the common language. But another implicit active structure was highlighted through the discourse. This gives a particular interpretation of a paradox observed in Tunisia, that of the coexistence of practices described as uncivil and a discourse from the very people practicing them, condemning these practices. It is the case about the private versus public space, like, for instance, using the work site for private purposes, or ensuring the cleanliness of one's street, but throwing garbage few streets away. It is as if those practices and the discourse about them obey respectively to two separate rationalities, one belonging to a recent modern culture and the other to an earliest anchored and traditional one. This reminds Moscovici's polyphasia, cognitive polyphasia concept. However, in one hand, it leads to assume that polyphasia should concern, in this case, not only the cognitive level, it should also concern the behavioral and discursive ones. In the other hand, it leads to assume that polyphasia shouldn't only exist between scientific and common sense thinking, but also between two different cultural patterns. The implicit dimension structuring the space conception among Tunisians is that opposing a close and a far space. This distance dimension seems to have a continuum degrees variation, while the private-public opposition is categorical. In this perspective, practices of the private and public space in Tunisian context should not be considered as uncivilian, but rather obeying to another civility. We can draw a parallel between these findings and anthropology conclusions about the tribal territory division in terms of in-group, out-group, familiar, unfamiliar, comforting, dangerous, relatives, strangers, etc. Moreover, this distant dimension is active across several aspects of groups' reality. Geographical one, that of the neighborhood, biological, that of blood relations, and groupal, that of the tribal belonging. That means that this dimension could constitute a theme in the sense of Moscovici and Vigneault. However, according to Lévi-Brul, we cannot understand a representation element without taking into account the other elements within. To comply with this idea, we have to take into account that this distance dimension have its meaning in respect to another principle that defines what makes the sociability. Another finding in the research is that the social bond is conceived primarily, if not exclusively, according to an emotional point of view. Society is conceived as formed with those with which one experiences positive affects, particularly compassion. In one hand, this is mentioned about those we know well. And on the other hand, to know a person, one must be close to her, whether in a real or a symbolic way. An underlying equation appears thus for the space organizing dimension and corollary for that organizing what makes the social bond. The equation is being close, equal knowing, equal sympathizing, equal being related. Consequences of this are multiple. In this context, otherness cannot be conceived as an abstraction. Others cannot be considered regardless their proximity degree, while the modern citizenship concept implies a supra-ordered categorization of the person. Finally, let's say that all this corresponds to an implicit tribal value system, or in other words, to a fundamental cultural dimension. I would like also to say that our reflection is in line with Lévi-Braull's epistemological posture, quoted by Moscovici in Raison et Culture. He advocated to disregard one's own thinking categories when exploring a particular community thinking and perceptions. I should precise that this should be even when it comes to the researcher to explore the cultural context he belongs to. Our reflection is overall in line with what Moscovici formulated in Raison et Culture. He advocated to introduce the culture concept in the explanation of meaning and thinking. More generally, he advocated to restore the culture in social psychology. According to him, social psychology aims to become an anthropology of the contemporary world, or in other words, a psychology of the culture, of our culture. In this regard, social representation theory deeply combines psychology and anthropology. This is crucial because culture has the function of representing the sociability and that of the constituting the reality. This is a vital function as societies are organized to act from within. The observations we repeatedly made in the Tunisian context concerning many representation objects lead to assume that the thinking antinomic structures would form one of the foundations upon which social representations are elaborated. I wish to go further regarding Moscovici's ternary perspective. We should situate, I think that we should situate the ego-alter object system in a broader context within which evolve a given collectivity with its cultural dimension, among other things. There is also a historical, geographical dimension, etc. This global context would give a specific meaning and a proper place to the self, to otherness, to a certain object, etc. Those meaning and place would be determined, for instance, by the person conception or the object's symbolic function, according to the culture. The cultural context would also determine the dynamic properties of the interactions between the ternary system elements, depending, for instance, on the degree of collectivism versus individualism, or on the value placed on conformity, etc. I will end here and hope that this figure summarizes well my argument. Thank you.